sure I don't bump it, that would be funny. Okay. Hello, I'm Natasha from Hot 104.7, The Morning Show, and as you know, I've been following Making a Murderer very closely. So this time, last time you saw me, I was with a bunch of non-experts and we were just giving our opinions, but this guy actually knows some stuff. It's Brett Waltner. He's a lawyer, so he knows legal things. Hello. And so we're going to talk about making a murderer with someone that actually knows laws and stuff. So instead of us just speculating, or I read this thing on Google, he's going to actually tell us what's going on. So I want to start with Brendan.
I'll try.
He'll try anyway. So I want to start with Brendan Dassey because I feel like a lot of people are iffy about Stephen Avery, but most people feel like Brendan Dassey got the short end of the stick, or just he didn't know what was going on. I mean, he just wanted to watch WrestleMania and go to his project in sixth period. So because he didn't have counsel or a parent or guardian in the interrogations, why was that okay to use?
Well, anytime a judge or a court is trying to decide whether a confession or an interrogation or an interview comes in, the challenge from a defense attorney's perspective, you can try to argue that it was either coercive, given under duress, and there is a specific test that the United States Supreme Court and the South Dakota Supreme Court has given, and they look at a bunch of different factors: age, suggestibility of the individual, what type of questions or what type of statements were used by law enforcement, and those sort of things. Obviously we didn't get to see how the judge made his decision. They just kind of referenced in the documentary that decided it was not coercive, or they viewed the evidence as admissible. So we didn't get to see the judge and what factors he relied on. I'll say when I watched it as well, you feel for the kid because he is very young. He seems very naive and limited, kind of cognitively, and I had some questions as well. But because we didn't get to see the whole video, and because we didn't get to see the decision the judge made and the details of that, we kind of have to defer to that.
Okay.
I'm not going to be able to say that the judge got that absolutely wrong just because
we
wasn't sitting there.
Yeah, but the parts we did see were kind of like, what?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's things in that video that were fairly concerning. I mean, kind of like you said, I think one of the parts that I think a lot of people had a hard time on is when they originally pulled him in, they said, well, we just want to confirm some things and get you out of here, and he seemed to kind of think that's what was going on, I'm done answering questions, can I go back to sixth period? And, and then even the day after when he's talking to his mom on the phone, talking about, well, I get to come home now, right? Those two things for someone that just, supposedly confessed to a really serious and really heinous crime, those two really don't match up.
Right. And I'd like to think I watch enough Law and Order that I would know to ask for a lawyer, I'm not talking to you till so-and-so's here or whatever. Yeah. But at the same time, when they say oh, this is an interrogation, we're just talking to you. Sure. I would be like, oh, okay. I might even say something that would be, I don't plan on killing anyone, but you never know what might come out of your mouth when they're just, talking to you.
That happens a lot. We get calls a lot about, hey, the police want to talk to me, should I? And we always make sure they understand their rights. Sometimes it may be where they just want to talk to them as potentially helping out and getting some information on a case they don't want. A lot of times if law enforcement is contacting someone and they have a good idea of what information they want, and law enforcement isn't necessarily going to say, hey, we think you did this, we want you to come talk. They're usually going to preface it by saying, hey, we just want to help clear things up. And what you have to realize is anytime that you do have the right to remain silent, anytime you do say something, just like you hear on Law and Order, they can use it against you, and a lot of times they do. Yeah. So I do think sometimes there's a misconception of maybe you're not in there, or I'm in here to answer some questions and I can just go. A lot of times they will tell you that. That doesn't mean they can't charge you later. So I do think that a lot of times, what I like about this documentary is I think it has gotten people talking about our system and talking about our rights, and I don't think it's a bad thing. I'm not here to say anything terribly negative about law enforcement, but I think anytime we can get people more understanding of what their rights are, we have our rights for a reason, and that is a good thing.
And then another thing in the documentary that a lot of people had a problem with was, obviously, Stephen Avery was suing the Manitowoc County Sheriff's Department when this whole Teresa Halbach thing started, and Calumet County was supposed to do everything. So is that something that happens a lot, or where there's the conflict of interest, and why were those two cops, Link and Colburn, even allowed anywhere near the stuff?
Sure, and it does happen. Obviously not to the level. This case is, I don't even think if
An
Law and Order would do this, you would think that it's who wrote this. But conflicts of interest happen a lot. For example, if you see in the news where there is a law enforcement involved shooting, let's say the department in some county was involved, that county's never going to investigate that. Usually the Department of Corrections is pulled in, and that is to avoid precisely what
his
potentially
buddy
happened
cops
in this
investigating
case.
it or whatever.
Yeah, and legally speaking, a conflict of interest is when we want to avoid even the appearance of impropriety. And I think at the initial press conference they actually talked about that when they were talking about Calumet County actually handling this and Manitowoc only giving certain assistance. And that's precisely why, because if Manitowoc County finds something of value, which they did in this case, there's of course going to be questions.
And it all looks really sketchy after the fact,
given this backdrop. So yeah, not to this extent does it happen around here as much, but yeah, that's exactly why when there's something called a conflict of interest, we want to avoid those just because there are going to be questions if something happens. Yeah, and I think you saw it in the documentary. They kind of characterized it again right away that Manitowoc County was just going to give resources, but we found that it was way more.
They were showing up all over the place.
Yeah.
Okay, and then just out of curiosity, Stephen Avery's defense, do you think it was a good defense? Like, do you think his lawyers were worth their money? And
they seem like very good attorneys. They seem very prepared.
Would you have done anything differently? Like, would you have argued a point differently or anything?
No, and I'm never going to play
do that to another lawyer.
One, because we just saw a documentary of 10 episodes. We didn't have all the evidence. We don't know all the rulings. I mean, all that comes into play. And anyone can sit and say, oh, because they lost, we would do things differently. I thought they did a really good job of doing what they could.
And I thought they were really great with the family too, like explaining every step that we saw anyway.
Yeah,
they'd be like, well, now this is going to happen and this is going to happen.
Yeah, they really seem to be. Yeah.
And then obviously there were kind of two, Brendan Dassey and Stephen Avery were both, charged for the murder of Teresa Hallbeck. What are kind of the obstacles of two trials kind of going on they weren't at the same time, but going on at kind of the same time?
So are you saying obstacles as far as the defense?
Yeah, because there's certain things you could say in this trial, but couldn't say in that one, or if something happened with Avery's case, then that would have to be applied kind of to Brendan's, right? Like if he was, because what was the thing about if they took the mutilation charge off of one, it had to be off of the other, or there were things like that.
There are times where co-defendants are charged together and they can be tried together, and a lot of times that can be up to the state or the prosecution to decide how they want to proceed. Other times they will proceed separately. Sometimes a defense attorney, if two defendants are together, you can make a motion to separate those, and there's a certain test that the court looks at to determine whether you can do that. Sometimes that becomes when, let's say you and I are charged in a crime together, and after we're arrested I say, well, Natasha did this, this, and this. We know that at a trial we have a right against what's called self-incrimination, and that means that at a trial I do not have to testify, and the state can't call me as a witness at my own trial. And that becomes a problem if I've said something against you. There's a Supreme Court case called Bruton, and there's a test, and I don't want to bore everybody. But yeah, that's one issue, whether co-defendants can testify against each other. Sometimes that's why things are split up. You talked about some of the counts being dismissed. Again, there wasn't a lot of explanation of how that happened and why that happened. But I think one of the things that happened is they were claiming that Brendan Dassey made all these admissions and gave all this information, and based on his admissions is when I think they added that mutilation of a body charge and the rape charge, and I can't remember what else. But because Brendan Dassey wasn't going to give that information and they didn't have any other evidence, it didn't seem like that established that, then they couldn't proceed on those but that was interesting because it seemed like that was already out in the public, and if you read some articles with the jurors, it seems like some of the jurors already knew that, or had already talked about
Right.
that, and so that's.
And I also read that some of the jurors from Stephen Avery's case then just went and watched Brendan's case because they wanted to hear like the other side of it or get.
Yeah,
I mean that's all kind of hearsay, but I mean.
The one juror, but he was the alternate, I think.
Yeah.
He ended up being the alternate, but he was at Brendan Dassey's.
Yeah.
And it sounds like he's.
And I'm sure there would be some curiosity, like what are they going to bring up
Sure.
here that maybe I didn't hear before or
Sure.
something. I don't know, but and this is kind of the $1 million question for anybody you ever meet that has seen Making a Murder. Do you think they did it?
I have no idea. I have no idea, and it's funny.
And that's kind of the number one answer.
Yeah.
Is like I don't know.
My wife and I watched this together. She's not an attorney, and throughout the whole thing, she would always say, "Do you think you did it?" And my answer kept coming back to, "I don't know." And sometimes, the way the episode would go, "Well, maybe he did," or then we would read things on the internet about evidence that wasn't shown in the documentary, and well, maybe he did. And at the end, she asked me, "Do you think he did it?" And I said, "I don't know." She said, "Well, quit giving me a lawyer answer. Tell me, do you think
like
he
as
did
a
it?"
person.
So personally, based on what I've seen and what I've read, just like everyone, all of you, and like you, I think he could have. I think there's obviously some really tough evidence against him. The fact that her remains were outside of his trailer, and she was the last person that he was the last person that supposedly saw her alive, and those sort of things.
But then there's other things that don't really add up.
Exactly.
Like if they really did brutally kill her the way that Brendan said, they didn't find blood anywhere in his trailer or garage. And
like you said,
it's all dusty. Like if they did clean it, then why is everything still dirty? You know what I mean?
Well, exactly. So there's just as many things on the other side.
Yeah.
And
that's why it's really confusing for people.
From my perspective, as an attorney and someone who is a criminal defense attorney, to me, I don't know beyond a reasonable doubt. And that's what I keep going back to. It's tough to send someone to prison for the rest of your life when I don't know, again, beyond that reasonable doubt, or really beyond even less than that, that he did it. But again, I have to go back and say, I wasn't at the trial, I didn't hear all the evidence. We have the perspective now, having seen the documentary about seeing some of the phone calls that happened and some of the stuff outside the trial, and I'm sure
that jurors would never get to
a lot of that they didn't see, and so we have a different perspective. And but to me, I don't know, and so to me, especially beyond a reasonable doubt.
Well, and I'm not a lawyer, but I was on a jury once, and that's a tough spot. Like the case I was on was nowhere near as life changing as like a murder trial, but I was like couldn't sleep the night before. Like I was worried about it. Like I couldn't imagine being on a jury for something this high profile, or
I think that would be tough too.
Yeah, it'd be really hard. Let me see here. Oh, another thing that a lot of people, they sort of touch on in the documentary, but not totally. The defense, they couldn't bring up any other scenarios or any other suspects. Like if Stephen Avery didn't do it, then who did? Because that's the one question we all kind of wanted to know. Yeah. But they weren't allowed to do that. They could only kind of, everything the state was saying, they could say, no, this is what. So is that kind of normal to not be able to bring in other theories, or?
It can be. Those sort of issues have been brought up in prior cases, and again, from what I've read too, they didn't deal a lot with that Making a Murderer, because it sounds like a couple of those potential third parties are Avery family members, and at least from what I read, there was questions of whether or not the family, since they were giving so much cooperation in making this documentary, didn't want some of that brought up.
Could be.
But generally, what that's called is evidence of a third party perpetrator, and there is there's decisions that have been made that kind of lay out what that test is. Kind of very briefly, it's that the evidence has to be somewhat reliable. The defense can't just throw a bunch of stuff at a wall and hopes to see that.
And hope something sticks.
Because we don't, with the theory that the Supreme Court has given is we don't want the jury just to become confused.
Because even I'm confused. Now that I've read all these theories, I wouldn't know what to think. But
Sure, and so that's why there's got to be some evidence attached to it. Again, I'm going to go back and say I wasn't at the trial, so I don't know what the judge considered and what he didn't, and the evidence that was in support of their theories. It seems like there was at least a little, but evidently the judge found that it wasn't enough to be able to present it to the jury.
What do you think about the conversation that this documentary has started, just about people wanting to learn more about? We kind of touched on knowing your rights a little bit more, just how the justice system works, how courts work, because even afterwards there were all these petitions online to get him exonerated or set free, but like the president can't do anything about it. Like all these people just think like, well, just let him go. Like so it's kind of interesting. What do you think about the conversation? It's at least starting for people to learn.
I think it's great. I think, you know, we talked about before about our rights. You know, 90% of the people, or 90% of us, when you say what are your rights, they may be able to recite some of the Miranda rights because they've seen it on Law and Order or other TV shows, but we really don't know what those mean. And so any conversation around this is good. You know, if people become more aware that something like this, a wrongful conviction, and again, I'm not going to say the murder case because we don't know, but you know, his rape conviction was overturned by DNA evidence. Things like that do happen. You know, you'll talk to some people, and when you hear they were called to jury duty, it's, oh no, how am I going to get out of this?
Right.
You know, do I have to go? You know, juries are a very important part of our society.
Well, I think people might, when they get called now, if they've seen this, they'll be like, okay, well that jury messed it up, so I'm going to really pay attention, and I'm going to really, you know.
And, you know, someone's going to potentially lose their liberty, you know, if a wrong decision is made. I think that's also kind of been brought to the forefront here, where let's just hypothetically say Stephen Avery didn't do this. You know, out of however many years he's been alive now, how many of that has been behind bars for something he didn't do?
A lot of it.
Yeah, so that's very concerning. So again, I think it's great. You know, it's got people talking, it's got people interested. Hopefully it just follows along now, and you know, the more people are educated, the better our society is.
Prior to us meeting, you had actually sent me an article, an interview that Dean Strang, one of his defense lawyers, did, and he said in that article that he believes that when cops plant evidence or exaggerate a story, they do it because kind of for a good reason. You know, like they really think this person did it, but they just don't have good enough evidence. Do you believe that happened here, or that it does happen?
I'm sure it does. And that's not to say I'm saying that it happens in Sioux Falls right now, because I actually, my background is out of law school. I worked for the Minnehaha County State's Attorney's Office for about 3.5 years, and since then I've been kind of on the other side. And so I sat in the role of a prosecutor, and I can tell you I didn't think any of my colleagues ever did anything intentional to put someone away for something they didn't do. Yeah, absolutely not. The other part of that is you get to know law enforcement officers, you know, when you're working on cases, and I've got some friends, even from before the time I went to law school, that have now become law enforcement officers. My brother-in-law is a law enforcement officer, and knowing those people like I do, and a lot of the officers I came in contact with, I can't see them ever doing anything purposely to put someone behind bars and lying about that. But just as, you know, our society in general is filled with some good people, and it's filled with people that aren't so good. You know, my profession gets a bad rap because, you know, there's been people that have done things that haven't been quite honest, and I think it's foolish to assume that, you know, the law enforcement profession is immune to that. You know, there's going to be bad apples everywhere, and so you know, as to why they would plant evidence, I don't know. Watching it, I have the same concerns as everyone else. It sure seems fishy, you know, just that and the circumstances about the multiple surges, and then you find this key, and then the whole blood thing, and, you know, all that. It sure is in the bullet too, and it sure seems suspicious. Whether or not they did it, I don't know. I think that goes back to talking about the conflict of interest thing, and they shouldn't even been there in the first place. You know, especially with the lawsuit going on. But again, I have never personally suspected, either when I was a prosecutor or now as a defense attorney working in any cases, that anything's been specifically planted. I might a lot of times disagree with the investigation's theory on something, or they think my client did it, and we sure think the evidence doesn't show that. But I'm not willing to go forward and say that they've done anything particular or specifically to frame anybody. I think that, I'm sure it happens, but I think it would be extremely rare.
And then I'm not sure how much you would know about this, because obviously you're not one of his lawyers and you don't know everything about his case. But I think everyone's big question now are like, what are his options? Because obviously the president can't just set him free. So, like, could another trial be possible? Could Brendan have another trial? What are their... Because they sort of touched on it at the end of Making a Murderer, but they made it sound like he was out of appeals. Are you ever truly out of appeals? Like, could something happen?
Well, yes. So, you know, everyone, I think the public generally thinks, well, when someone goes through a jury trial, hey, let's just appeal this because the jury didn't get it right, and so we want the court to overturn it. You can appeal a jury decision. Most of the time when you're appealing, especially if it's a state court trial, so if we're in South Dakota State Court, you have the right to appeal to the South Dakota Supreme Court, okay? Most of the time you are appealing legal issues, so if the judge let's say in the Stephen Avery case, the judge in Brendan Dassey's case didn't exclude the confession. You can challenge that if the Supreme Court feels that the judge in that case should have excluded it because he didn't follow the precedent of case law and Supreme Court, or United States Supreme Court case law. A new trial can be granted for those reasons, okay? A lot of times in an appeal, you will bring up the issue of whether or not the jury made the wrong decision. I don't know how many times that's ever been granted, but I'll tell you it'd be very extremely rare because the Supreme Court, we give a lot of deference to the jury. The jury is what's considered a fact finder. They get to decide what the facts are and what happened. We give them the law to say you need to find the facts and then apply them to this law. But because of that, we give a lot of deference to jury's decisions. And if it's at all conceivable, a jury's decision is going to stand. If the Supreme Court declines your appeal, you can appeal. You can apply for an appeal to the United States Supreme Court. They have to accept it, and most of the time they're not going to.
Okay.
There's some federal appeals you can make. If your case is in federal court, you can go to we're in the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals. There's also a challenge beyond the appeal called it's an application for habeas corpus, and you're basically alleging that you're being held unconstitutionally because one of your rights were violated throughout the trial, and that's often done by people in custody as well. I don't know what Stephen Avery is all contested. I don't know the level he's at.
Yeah.
It would seem to me the amount of time that's gone by and the amount of things they talked about that those sort of channels are probably done. He's probably done that. But I think there's always a possibility, like they talked about, if other evidence unfolds, then you can potentially be granted a trial based on that new evidence.
Because I just watched the Dateline special and the Discovery ID special.
I did too.
And he does have a new lawyer, and she seems to think, there's new testing that they could have done, or I heard she even bought a RAV4 to
Yeah, I saw that too.
That's
interesting.
But
she seems to have a good track record.
So I guess some of that we'll just have to wait and see, because that is how we got out the first time, was new DNA testing was done.
Well, sure, so, and that was 20 years after the fact, and so
science is always moving along.
His I guess what I would call regular appeals or the normal appeal process had kind of run, but there was new evidence that was discovered, and he was granted a new trial or exonerated based on that. So that can happen with physical evidence down the road, but.
Okay. Well, I think that's all the questions I have. Did you have anything you'd like to add?
No.
All right. Well, we still don't know if he did it or not. We'll have to wait and see what happens. Thanks for watching.